Good morning. This is part of the front matter for the book that helped inspire this talk called Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. And that's going to be my only slide. You can just consider that as I go through because everything is founded in particularly that description, but we'll be revisiting it often. So my favorite description of beginner's mind pertains to calligraphy. The Zen way is to write in the most straightforward, simple way as if you were a beginner, not trying to make something skillful or beautiful, but simply writing with full attention, as if you were discovering what you were writing for the first time. Today, I claim that the Python community is as robust as it is because it aligns with this approach, and we'll describe ways it can continue to do so. I'm going to describe how beginner's mind is an asset at every stage of your career, to every degree you're working with people or code. And finally, I'll touch on complementary theories of education and learning. But seeing as how this is a tech event, I'm going to start with pizza. My first paying job was at Little Caesars. And when I started, I was terrible at it. I was a sign holder, and in all fairness to myself, I could definitely hold a sign. I didn't make Little Caesars look like a place you wanted to go, but hey, that wasn't the job title. Since then, I've been a beginner many times over, as a cook, a secretary, a scientist, and though each time I've started out mediocre at best, I've rarely thought, I'm too stupid to do this. But I've given myself no such latitude learning to code. The parallel I'm drawing here is not between the tasks, but between what they demand for success. In a book on creativity, the author Ken Robinson writes, if someone tells you they cannot read or write, you don't assume that they don't know how, or rather that they are incapable, but they haven't been taught. When I can't write working code, I think I'm signaling some fundamental incapability, not that I'm struggling because this is new. Success requires being able to overcome this, and that needs to be a deliberate process. And I know I'm not alone. I suspect most people here have heard of imposter syndrome. All evidence or competence or ability is dismissed, with the person thinking their accomplishment can just be chalked up to luck or deception, that they're frauds instead of the real deal. This misguided idea of inherent ability or talent is part of a constellation of excellent, necessary conversations happening in tech today. The more discourse I read around education, ability, and code, the more distilled these toxic assumptions and their corollaries are. That education can be a reliable index of coding ability, or that coding ability can be a reliable index of intelligence, or that intelligence is the sole reliable index of value in the workplace. In early 2014, I read an article about how Google had long collected hiring data and realized it needed to change its heuristics. The top grades from top schools were not sufficient and not even necessary. In that article, there was an interview with the vice president of Google's people operations that said, without humility, you're unable to learn. People who rarely experience failure don't know how to benefit from it when it happens, he says, and instead commit the fundamental attribution error, which is if something good happens, it's because I'm a genius. If something bad happens, it's because someone's an idiot, or I didn't get the resources, or the market moved. So there you have it from the Google People Operations horse's mouth. It's not a horse. Failure is part of the development they're looking for. When I read that article, I was a few months out from a liberal arts undergrad, so frankly, I found it pretty affirming. I'm probably not the only person here who clicks on headlines like, in defense of the liberal education, or liberal education. At least it's not murder. The value of such an education is a worthy topic, but out of scope for this talk. The thread I followed from that experience to tech today is more about what it was like to have stringent interdisciplinary requirements, to visibly be a beginner so many times over. The professor from my first humanities class was a specialist in Chinese art history, an urbane Italian man, who called me into his office after my first essay to lucidly, sympathetically, hand my ass to me. My work had been mediocre. The failure itself didn't sting as much as knowing that I'd worked hard and it simply wasn't good enough. One nice part about being a scholarship kid was that no matter how much I wanted to catastrophize that, I just had to keep doing the thing. Between the clarity of how far I needed to go and understanding I needed to go that far to have professional and personal security, I started triangulating the phenomenon I came to talk to you about today. Whether Python is your first language or your fifth, beginner's mind is an asset. It means being able to say, I don't know, or how to ask for help. hiring managers have told me that it's at least as important for a candidate to speak comfortably on what they don't know as it is for them to speak comfortably on what they do. And it's simple, knowing when to ask for help is actually explicitly part of engineers' professional development. Simple is where I work. Python values making space for beginners. This very conference has a beginner's track. And if you search on pyvideo.org, it's the official site for conference videos, you'll find over 100 videos returned when you just look for material for beginners. When the community offers beginner-friendly content, it makes people feel like it's okay to just be starting out. It invites humility and wonder. It puts a lot of people who can help each other out in the same room together. I started going to local Python meetups because they'd regularly feature peer mentoring nights or introductory talks, which, even if they were still over my head, gave me permission to show up and to know little. I learned at these meetups that there are many beginner levels, and that I could be helpful early on. And many kinds of wins like this go far when you're just starting out. These can look like getting your code running at all, or the point system over at Treehouse, or partnership with other new coders. The idea that there is a clear hierarchy of value on a team founded in lines of code written or years in the industry is misleading. And this isn't to say that we should devalue experience, but that we should appreciate the range of contributions people can make, no matter where they are in their timeline. In her popular PyCon 2014 talk on technical onboarding, Nicole Zuckerman talks about how when she onboarded, she found that an experienced mentor on the team was unprepared to help her set up her environment, while a relatively junior person was able to help because they'd just gone through exactly that process. The takeaway was that this process needed people across the spectrum of experience, and that anyone on the team should be prepared to contribute. But as you move along that spectrum of experience, it's still essential to keep in mind how your proximity to the beginning can work for you. Edmund Lau, who's been an engineer for around a decade and recently published The Effective Engineer, writes that the single greatest mistake you can make early in your career is not to focus on continued learning. More specifically, calls it not optimizing your learning rate, which I think is a very engineering way of putting that. By this, he means it's essential to seek out mentors and choose jobs that explicitly prioritize your growth, but he also advocates learning how to have difficult conversations with the people we find challenging to work with. He writes, small deltas in your learning rate make a huge difference in the long run because investments in yourself compound over time. In terms of coding, these habits are many, like documentation and testing, but also code review and postmortems. Today I'll focus on documentation and testing because they're specifically influenced by Python's development and history. It's not just for other people's sake we write the docs, it's also for our future selves. Developing the habit early on in your career will make it less painful later, because it'll properly set our expectations for what the coding process comprises. I work with an excellent contributor to the Python community at Simple, Rob Story, who recently told me, sometimes I'll go days without writing a single line of code, and that's okay. Every new project is an opportunity to consider deeply what I really know about the project and what remains unclear, what assumptions I make going in. Citing Rob again, he doesn't just document his code, but his broad ideas about the architecture, how he plans to fit everything into other teams' work. We also find this idea in the 2004 Python design document, sometimes called the Zen of Python. If the implementation is hard to explain, it's a bad idea. If the implementation is easy to explain, it might be a good idea. I recently read an article extolling Python's quality of documentation that was written 15 years ago, saying the culture of the Python community reinforces high standards in documentation. Programmers' efforts to document their code carefully boosts Python's strength even further and attracts more practitioners for whom this documentation is important. The cycle continues. Another feedback loop of excellence in Python development is also its response to the value of testing. It's even part of the standard library. And each chapter in the updated edition of Think Python by Alan Downey has a section on debugging. Every recorded PyCon I found, going back 6 years, also features at least a dozen talks on the subject of testing alone. We all hear that testing is an essential part of writing code, so that won't be my tack today, but it's important. It's the quintessential exercise in beginner's mind. It's humbling, it's creative, and it requires challenging your own assumptions. But such mindfulness for software is not enough. You need a solid relationship with your collaborators at work and beyond. Being a good coworker or teammate is no less deserving of deliberation than being a good engineer. The most succinct way, but probably not the most original way that I know of putting this is to say that, at least at work, You can teach someone how to code, but you can't teach them how not to be a jerk. And this is only possible when your engineers accept the premise that personal development is part of their path. Finding these engineers takes a great deal more sophistication than just reading a CV. But the spirit of collaboration and communication are part of the DNA of Python. Python creator Guido has said that his most innovative contribution to Python's success was making it easy to extend. And since that innovative contribution, Python has accumulated over 127,000 user group members in nearly 200 cities and about 400 countries worldwide. PyLadies alone exists in at least 50 cities worldwide. Some of this growth is surely organic, but it's also a deliberate process. Python grants several awards a year to people nominated by other members of the community for their services as volunteers. Both community conferences and PyCon itself are only made possible by volunteer effort. And how many of you have helped out with swag bag stuffing at PyCon? There's no more beautiful illustration of generalizing the engineering mindset than how passionately people advocate for optimizing the process of putting stuff in bags. I watch members of this community push each other every day to go for this job or that speaking gig, especially Thursday, good word. Debug each other's code in Slack or proselytize each other's libraries. I see Guido telling women at PyCon that he wants to hear from them in Q&As first. It's powerful to feel like you have people in your corner. But beginner's mind is an essential tool to being in someone's corner too. I've been helping out with career panels and other mentoring opportunities for a couple of years now, and the diversity of experiences I encounter there is truly extraordinary. I think it's one of the more commendable features of Python as a language, and it's also an essential place to focus our growth. We recognize this in a diversity statement, but also with a wiki, with specific advice and related literature. However, as with code, it also needs testing. That is, to know whether this advice and literature actually reflects our best efforts in the community, we have to subject it to review. Erica Baker wrote an excellent piece earlier this week calling attention to what proportion of diversity efforts are focused on women explicitly while ignoring the other facets of underrepresentation in tech, namely race. It's an uncomfortable conversation, but she's making an explicit call for tech to do better, and Python has already set a precedent for answering such calls. In 2011, 1% of talks at PyCon were by women. But for the last 2 PyCons, that number has been 33%. How we continue to answer calls like Baker's will require a readiness to solicit and integrate feedback, as with any technical project. For example, there's a clear etiquette around asking questions in software development. We see this in Eric Raymond's piece on asking questions the smart way, essentially RTFM. And in the culture of Stack Overflow, which recommends asking questions as if you're talking to a busy colleague. We should generalize this kind of respect for people's time to questions about, say, intersectionality. And we'll need to be this diligent about self-education because technology cycles quickly. The openness required of a beginner is how we keep up with change, because it's not just about tracking new frameworks. It's about tracking how people think about technology, how pedagogy changes, and how the Python community's increasing diversity means people with divergent backgrounds are working alongside each other for perhaps the first time. PyLadies holds talks and workshops regularly, and just as regularly has to reassess the needs and learning styles of its attendees. I ran a workshop recently that an attendee left because I didn't know how to help her with her environment given the OS she was using. Anil Dash asked on Twitter a couple of weeks ago, what made people quit learning to code? And so many responses resonated with me, both as a self-taught programmer and as a nascent teacher. A huge part of the battle is dealing with dependencies, or workflow management, but many of the responses described poor learning environments too. Sasha Landi is repeatedly told, but you have people skills. You should do product management. Instead, she's just languishing as an engineer and co-founder of her own data science consultancy in New York. I'm sure we all feel very bad for her. The first time I tried to teach an introduction to Python, I was totally blindsided by how I'd misunderstood the needs of people new to programming. I dropped the term IDEs like it was common knowledge. I used circular metaphors. The sessions were only saved by people's patience with my own learning curve and my setting up multiple avenues for feedback. I asked for feedback in the class, but it's difficult to be the first and potentially the only person saying you don't understand. I emailed people afterward and received some hesitant feedback in that context too. And finally, I sent a brief survey people could respond to and wound up with enough data to totally reformat the class. I wish I could say that sufficed, but the class lapsed a few weeks later. The reasons varied widely. but included important information to consider for encouraging people to take up code. And some of it was logistical. It's taxing to work a full-time job and balance other obligations and still make time in your life to learn coding or to take a weekend for a conference. It's essential we stop underestimating how much of a privilege spare time is. It's easy to say someone isn't dedicated enough to keep attending class when you fail to see that they have a second job or a family. But I see Python community practices today that account for this. Meetups having multiple times a week, or with broader windows for attendance. PyDX itself offers childcare. I want to just clap for that, actually. They'll be giving a talk later. I've heard clamoring online for encouraging employers to make space for people to learn and receive mentoring on the job. Beginner's Mind allows us to examine what about our conditions we can build for each other's success. Aside from the logistical constraints for my students, though, was exactly the mindset I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, that disruptive internal dialogue saying you're essentially incapable somehow. It is in this respect that I found the Python community to be the greatest salve. I gave a talk on Python for data analysis a few months ago and botched some live coding, derailing the rest of the talk. I fixed it after several uncomfortable and video-documented minutes, and struggled with that sense of failure afterward. But it helped to meet inimitable bot maker Darius Kazemi, also known as Tiny Subversions on Twitter, over lunch that day. If you don't know Darius by name, you might have used his controversial sorting hat bot, which put me in Slytherin, to my chagrin. I'm gonna stay away from that guy. When I talked about what had happened, though, he said he actually likes to leave mistakes in all of his demos, so people see that they happen to everyone. Since then, I've taken a more exploratory mindset when I pair with other people, and it's clear that people rarely see that process of stumbling and recovery as just a waste of time. Writing garbage and then refactoring, failing tests and furiously Googling are all non-trivial proportions of the work we do on any project. That is the work. I'm not saying you should botch your live demos deliberately. They do pretty well on their own. And besides, you always have to make about 10 minutes for AV failure. I don't know how this will most elegantly be implemented to make the process more transparent, but I do see institutions like Treehouse trying to anticipate student struggles and prepare them for it. I've noticed their video lectures retain things like syntax errors that the teacher has to catch and then fix on the fly, and it's memorable. A flawless video leaves infinite the space where code can go wrong and skews our perception of their commonality. It makes us feel exceptional. I think one of the greatest contributing factors to this despair is the false belief that some of us have technical talent and some of us just don't, and that innate factors are the most meaningful signals of capacity at all. Of course, we don't just see this in tech. A behavioral psychologist researching the subject said in an interview recently, "A belief in inborn gifts and limits is much gentler on the psyche. The reason you aren't a great opera singer is because you can't be one. That's simply the way you were wired. Thinking of talent as innate makes our world more manageable, more comfortable. It relieves a person of the burden of expectation." And when I read that, I balked at it. I'd argue this is only comforting insofar as you aren't otherwise driven to pursue what you aren't good at. The idea of an innate capacity isn't just toxic in the unrealistic standards it sets, but in its implicit devaluing of hard work, of diligence. People can buy into the idea that Mark Zuckerberg stayed up all night, many nights, to build Facebook, but what do we imagine? That he was staying up all night because they didn't have Stack Overflow back then? Or that he was too busy killing it? And this isn't just a soapbox, this is founded in evidence. Stanford psychology researcher Carol Dweck has spent decades studying the disparities in success between people who subscribe to a fixed or an incremental view of intelligence. The former is that subset I was just describing, that you're born brilliant or you're born doomed. The latter perceives intelligence as more a function of time and deliberate effort, a malleable feature, and within your control. My favorite study of hers is one in which she takes a group of elementary school students and gives them an easy math exam, and following separates them into two groups. One she praises for their intelligence, and one she praises for their hard work. And afterward, as is the wont of any grade school teacher, she crushes their spirits with a follow-up math exam that is significantly harder than they're capable of. And what she found in their performance and in their attitude following was that the students who had been praised for their intelligence collapsed. They gave up, they were miserable, they didn't enjoy themselves, they weren't motivated, And the students that she had praised for their hard work said that they enjoyed it. With more time on the test, they wound up collaborating with each other and said that it felt like a puzzle and that it was their favorite math exam. So we already know that people make Python great and have prioritized building a community toward that end. But Python can also help make people great. For better or worse, coding is not just part of our infrastructure, but our zeitgeist. So for example, just as an aside, I just read an article about a survey sent out in the UK of 1,000 parents, 60% roughly of whom said they would rather their kids learn Python than French. So the everyday practice can be the platform for enacting the technical and personal excellence Python has already seen from us from the beginning.